In the summer of 1940, the Royal Air Force went into the most important battle in its history, with a fighter that was already considered out of date. It was slower than the enemy. It was built partly from wood and fabric, using methods that belonged to the 1920s. Test pilots who had flown the new all-metal machines called it a compromise, and when the fighting was over, that supposedly obsolete aeroplane had shot down more German aircraft than the Spitfire, the anti-aircraft guns, and every other British defense combined. At least, that is the story you have almost certainly heard. The truth is stranger, and it is not quite what either side of the argument wants it to be. To understand why the Hawker Hurricane existed at all, you have to understand how frightened Britain was in the early 1930s, and how little it had done about it. The Royal Air Force of that decade was still flying biplanes, beautiful ones in fairness. The Hawker Fury was fast, elegant, and utterly conventional, with 2 wings, an open cockpit, and a fixed undercarriage. It was the peak of an idea that was about to die. Across the North Sea, Germany was rearming, and the aircraft coming out of German factories were single-wing monoplanes with retractable wheels and enclosed cockpits. Everyone in British aviation could see what was coming. What they could not agree on was how to get there. The man who solved it was Sidney Cam, the chief designer at Hawker Aircraft, and his solution was not the boldest one available, it was the smartest one. Cam did not start from a blank sheet. He started from the Fury, the biplane his company already knew how to build, and he asked a very specific question. What is the fastest possible monoplane fighter we can make using the tools, the materials, and the workforce we already have in this building? Not the best fighter imaginable. The best fighter that could actually exist, in numbers, in time. So the Hurricane kept the Fury's basic skeleton. Underneath the skin was a framework of steel tubes, bolted rather than welded, braced into rigid triangles, with wooden formers shaping the outside and doped fabric stretched over the rear fuselage. It was, in engineering terms, a biplane's body with a monoplane's wing and a modern engine bolted to the front. Purists called it a hybrid. They were right. What they missed was that the hybrid was the point. Because here is the thing that decides wars, and it is almost never the thing that gets remembered. Britain in 1935 did not have enough factories tooled for stressed skin metal construction. It did not have enough workers trained in it. It did have hundreds of skilled men in workshops across the country who had spent their whole careers building tubular steel frames and covering them in fabric, because that is how every aeroplane had been built for 20 years. Cam designed an aircraft those men could build immediately, in quantity, without retooling anything. The prototype first flew in November of 1935, from Brooklands in Surrey, with the Hawker test pilot George Bullman at the controls. It had a Rolls-Royce engine that would soon be named the Merlin, 8 machine guns buried in the wings, and a top speed comfortably over 300 miles an hour. The Royal Air Force ordered 600 of them before the official specification had even been finalized, which was, by the standards of 1930s British procurement, an act of near recklessness. It was also the single most important decision anybody made about the air defense of Britain. And that is where the Hurricane's real advantage begins. Because speed was never what made it matter. What made the Hurricane genuinely distinctive was not any single quality. It was a combination that no rival possessed at the same time, and it only becomes obvious when you stop comparing top speeds and start thinking about what an Air Force actually needs from a fighter over months of continuous fighting. Start with the wing. The Hurricane's wing was thick, broad, and deep. Aerodynamically, this was a liability, and it cost the aircraft perhaps 30 miles an hour against a thinner design. But a thick wing is a strong wing, and a strong wing is a stable one. The Hurricane could be hauled around the sky, pushed to the edge of a stall, and pulled out of a dive without the pilot wondering whether the structure would follow. It turned tighter than the Messerschmitt Bf 109. In a low-speed turning fight, the German fighter could not stay with it. Then there is the gun platform, which sounds like a technicality and is not. The Hurricane's 8 guns were grouped close together in the wings, near the fuselage, and the aircraft was rock steady when they fired. Compare that with fighters whose armament was spread far out along the wing, where every burst set up a vibration and the shots spread apart at range. Hurricane pilots consistently reported that their aircraft simply sat still and delivered everything into one place. Against a heavy bomber, that concentration mattered more than an extra 30 miles an hour ever would. Then the undercarriage. The Hurricane's wheels retracted inward, toward the fuselage, which gave it a wide planted stance on the ground. The Spitfires retracted outward, which gave it a narrow track and a reputation for ground looping in the hands of an inexperienced pilot. In 1940, Fighter Command was running out of experienced pilots and filling squadrons with boys who had a few dozen hours on type. An aircraft that was forgiving on a rough grass airfield in the dark was not a minor convenience. It was aircraft and pilots preserved. And then, the quality that mattered most of all, and the one nobody puts on a specification sheet, the Hurricane could be repaired. A Spitfire with a hole punched through its stressed metal skin needed a factory or a specialist repair depot because the skin was structural, and damage to the skin was damage to the aircraft. A Hurricane, with a hole punched through the fabric of its rear fuselage, needed a fitter, a patch, some dope, and an afternoon. The steel tube frame beneath could be inspected, straightened, and rebraced by men working out of a tent beside a grass strip in Kent. Squadrons could take an aircraft that had come home shot to pieces in the morning and fly it again the next day. That is the Hurricane's real innovation, and it has nothing to do with speed. It was designed from the beginning to be built fast and mended fast, and in the summer of 1940, that turned out to be the only quality that counted. Because when the fighting started, the question was never which aircraft was better. It was how many aircraft were still flying tomorrow. When the Battle of Britain opened in July of 1940, Fighter Command had roughly 32 squadrons of Hurricanes and around 19 of Spitfires. That ratio is the foundation of everything that followed. There were simply more Hurricanes, in more places, doing more of the fighting, on more days. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group over southeast England, worked out a division of labor that made the most of what he had. Where the timing allowed it, Spitfires would climb to engage the German fighter escort high above, and Hurricanes would go for the bombers underneath. It was never a rigid rule, and on many days the interception was so rushed that everyone simply fought whatever was in front of them. But as a general intention, it shaped the battle. The Spitfires kept the Messerschmitts busy, the Hurricanes killed the bombers, and the Hurricanes killed a great many of them. The Heinkel 111, the Dornier 17, the Junkers 88, and above all, the Junkers 87 Stuka, which was so vulnerable to the Hurricane that it was effectively withdrawn from the battle in August after appalling losses over the Channel and the South Coast. The cost was severe, and it fell hardest on exactly the men doing the most dangerous work. Hurricanes were slower, so they were harder to disengage. They were sent against bomber formations, so they flew into concentrated defensive fire. And they carried a fuel tank in the fuselage, directly ahead of the cockpit, behind the engine. When a round found that tank, fire came straight back through the instrument panel into the pilot's face. That single design detail produced some of the most harrowing human stories of the entire war, and it is where this aircraft stops being a machine. On the 16th of August 1940, Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of No. 249 Squadron was flying his Hurricane over Southampton when his section was jumped from behind. Cannon fire tore through the cockpit. One round wounded him in the foot, another shattered the canopy and injured his eye, and the fuel tank ahead of him caught, filling the cockpit with flame. Everything about that moment said, "Get out." Nicholson had the canopy open, he was already burning, and the aircraft was finished. Then a Messerschmitt 110 crossed in front of him, and he sat back down in the fire and went after it. They told us it was impossible. A myth whispered in hushed tones among the deepest echelons of power. They told us it was impossible. A myth whispered in hushed tones among the deepest echelons of power. And he became the only pilot of Royal Air Force Fighter Command to receive the Victoria Cross in the entire Second World War. Nicholson himself spent the rest of his life insisting he had done nothing exceptional and that others had done far more. That is what makes the story worth telling, because he was not the exception. He was the visible example of something that was happening across dozens of squadrons every week. The burns unit at the Queen Victoria Hospital at East Grinstead, where the surgeon Archibald McIndoe rebuilt the faces and hands of aircrew, filled with men who had come out of that particular cockpit. They called themselves the Guinea Pig Club, because the surgery being performed on them had never been attempted before. A great many of them were Hurricane pilots, and they were not all British. No. 303 Squadron, flying Hurricanes out of Northolt, was manned by Polish pilots who had already lost their country and flown against the same enemy twice before. They became the highest-scoring squadron in Fighter Command during the battle. The most successful individual Allied pilot of the entire Battle of Britain was a Czech, Josef František, flying a Hurricane with that Polish squadron. He was killed in October of 1940, in a crash near Ewell, at the age of 26. So the legend says the Hurricane won the Battle of Britain, and the men who flew it certainly earned that sentence. But the honest record is more complicated than the legend, and it cuts in both directions. Start with the claim itself, the one you see repeated everywhere, that Hurricanes destroyed more German aircraft than all other British defenses combined. The underlying figures come from wartime combat claims, and wartime combat claims were wrong, not dishonestly wrong. In a swirling fight, 3 pilots firing at the same bomber will each watch it fall away trailing smoke, and each will sincerely report a kill. When historians compared British claims against German loss records after the war, the total British claim was overstated by something in the region of 2 to 3 times. They told us it was impossible. A myth whispered in hushed tones among the deepest echelons of power. So the raw numbers are unreliable. What survives the correction is the proportion. Hurricanes did account for the majority of German aircraft destroyed by fighters during the battle, and the reason is not mysterious. There were more of them, and they were pointed at the bombers. Which brings us to the second myth, the one that has grown up in reaction to the first. There is a strand of enthusiasm that argues the Hurricane was therefore the better fighter, and that the Spitfire was overrated glamour that stole the credit. That is not supported by the evidence either. Hurricane losses were proportionally heavier than Spitfire losses. Against the Messerschmitt 109 on equal terms, the Hurricane was outclassed in speed, in climb, and in performance at altitude, and its pilots knew it. By 1941, it was clearly obsolescent as a frontline day fighter in Europe, while the Spitfire went on developing through the whole war. The truthful version is less satisfying than either camp would like. The Hurricane did more of the work, because there were more of them, and because they were given the job that produced the most kills. It was not the better fighter. It was the available fighter, and availability, in that specific summer, was worth more than performance. There is a third myth worth correcting, because it is half true, and the half that is false gets repeated most. You will hear that the Hurricane's fabric covering made it tougher, because cannon shells passed straight through the rear fuselage without detonating. There is something in this. Fabric over an open steel frame does not always trigger a fuse, and the structure could survive damage that would have wrecked a stressed skin tail. But the same fabric burned, and the fuel tank ahead of the pilot burned with it. Calling the Hurricane tough because of its fabric, while ignoring what that construction cost the men in the Guinea Pig Club, is the kind of tidy story that gets told when nobody has to live inside it. What is genuinely remarkable is what happened to the Hurricane after everyone agreed it was finished. Declared obsolescent as a European day fighter, it simply went and found other work. It became a fighter bomber over occupied France. It flew from the deck of aircraft carriers as the Sea Hurricane, and in one of the more extraordinary arrangements of the war, it was fired off a rail mounted on the bow of a merchant ship in mid-Atlantic to chase away German patrol aircraft on a one-way flight, after which the pilot ditched in the sea and hoped the convoy would stop for him. It fought over Malta. It fought over the Western Desert, where a ground attack version carried underwing guns against Axis vehicles. It fought in Burma against the Japanese, and in the autumn of 1941, No. 151 Wing of the Royal Air Force flew Hurricanes from a frozen airfield near Murmansk, defending the Soviet Union alongside Soviet pilots they could not speak to. By the time production ended in 1944, something in the region of 14,500 Hurricanes had been built, in Britain, in Canada, and under license elsewhere. It served on every front on which Britain fought. And yet the Spitfire got the statue, the film, and the memory. Partly, that is aesthetics, because the Spitfire is one of the most beautiful objects ever made, and the Hurricane is not. Partly, it is wartime publicity, which fixed on the Spitfire early and never let go, to the visible irritation of Hurricane squadrons, who kept reading newspaper accounts of battles they had fought. And partly it is simply that the Spitfire kept getting better while the Hurricane's moment passed. But the fairest way to end is with the thing that actually decided it. In the summer of 1940, Britain did not need the best fighter that could be designed. It needed the most fighters that could be built, delivered, flown by inexperienced pilots, shot to pieces, patched up overnight, and flown again the next morning. Sidney Cam understood that in 1935, when he chose to build his monoplane out of the methods his workshops already knew, instead of the methods that were fashionable. That decision looked like a compromise. It looked, to some people, like timidity. It meant there were enough fighters. The Hurricane was never the best aircraft in the sky over southern England. It did not need to be. It only needed to be there, in numbers, on the morning the bombers came, with a young man in the cockpit who had 30 hours on type and a fuel tank in front of him that he tried not to think about. That is not a story about a wonder weapon. It is a story about what happens when someone designs for reality instead of for the record books, and about the people who then had to fly the result.